Michael coughed, his mouth full of grass and soil. He spat it out, trying to ignore the sour taste on his tongue, and sat up to look around. Somehow, he had managed to fall face down in a large field, with grass so tall it was up to his knees. He turned around to where he thought the door was, but it had vanished. A quiver ran through his insides. Did this mean that he couldn't get back? He stood up, trying to see if there was someone about whom he could ask, but even from this level, there was no sign of anyone. He was in an empty field, alone, and he had no idea where to go. A bird flew over his head, swooping across the sky, and landing in a tree overhanging the field. He looked at it, taking in the tufted blue tail and the speckled pink and orange feathers that covered its body. It was unlike any bird he'd ever seen, even the ones in his father's great encyclopedia of British wildlife. Perhaps it was a tropical bird, and the door had transported him to somewhere in the rainforest. The bird cocked his head at him and whistled, and Michael realized that he was wrong. Rainforests didn't have open fields like this. They were dense places full of trees and vines, constantly damp with moisture from the air. There was nothing like that here. The bird flew off to his right, and as he followed it with his gaze, he saw that there were several small buildings in the distance. He couldn't make them out properly from where he was, but they looked like thatched cottages. A sign of people. Perhaps one of them knew where Ramble lived, and could tell Michael how to get home, too. He took one last look around the field just to make sure that the door definitely wasn't there, and then followed the bird as it soared straight ahead for the cottages. It took him a long time just to get out of the field, and he spent most of it trying to keep his school shoes out of muddy puddles that were camouflaged amongst the tall grass. But after a while, he gave up, discovering that his shoes were torn and his toes were poking out. It was like they'd suddenly shrunk. His clothes felt similarly tight and had ripped down the seams in several places, but it was so warm out that it didn't matter. Now that he thought about it, it was very warm, as though it was the height of summer and not the middle of January. Maybe this place was on the other side of the world. He knew that there were countries that were now enjoying summer. Was this one of them? Still, as he watched the bird arc up and down in the sky, flying as though it didn't have any cares at all, he couldn't shake the feeling that this place might not be in his world at all. It was as though he'd fallen into one of the worlds in the books he'd read, full of strange creatures, and as he came in sight of a particularly large puddle, hundreds of ghost spheres. They were just floating there, above the watery ground, clumped together like a cloud. They weren't possessing anyone. They were just there. He had never seen them do that before. At every encounter he'd had with them, they'd always had a host. He jumped around the puddle, fearing that they might latch on to him, but they remained still, as though they hadn't even noticed he was there. Uneasily, he sidled away from them, jumping as the bird whistled at him from a tree. It cocked its head again, watching him with beady eyes, as though checking to make sure he was still following. As he neared the thatched cottages, he saw that there were more of them than he'd originally thought. In fact, it appeared to be a small town, with a stone wall surrounding it, breaking only for the large iron gate in front of him. To the side was a small stone hut, and as he examined it, the bird flew directly towards it, diving straight through the stone. A moment later, the door to the hut crashed open, and two men burst out of it, heading straight for him. They were both dressed in leather kilts with polished metal helmets on their heads, and carried small sharp swords and round shields. He was terrified. Just as he was contemplating where to run to, they stopped and cried out in surprise. They lowered their swords and sheathed them quickly, almost embarrassed.
"Wizard Ramble, please forgive us," one of them said, making a short bow. "Our messenger told us that someone had come through the door between worlds, and with all the talk about, we naturally assumed it was the demons.